So I will start to get underway as people still log in. First of all, we'd like to begin by acknowledging the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where I am zooming in from today. And I'd like to extend that acknowledgement to the elders past, present, and emerging on the lands that you are all zooming in on today if you're in Australia. For those international guests tonight, we do an acknowledgement of country at the beginning of all of our talks and our lectures. This is to acknowledge that, you know, the Indigenous people of Australia have a continuing cultural affinity with the land, and these lands were never ceded. And so it's really important that we acknowledge where we come from and on whose land we actually come in on each time we gather, whether we're in person in a museum or on Zoom land. So tonight, I am thrilled to be able to welcome back Chris Norden to the Chau Chak Wing Museum, which I am fictionally in tonight. Chris joined us a couple of years ago now when he was visiting Australia, and I hope to see Chris again in person soon. But tonight we were thrilled to be able to welcome Chris to explore some of his new publications that have come out. Chris, for those who don't know, is the former director of the Egypt Exploration Society. The Nicholson collection obviously has a real affinity with the Egypt Exploration Society, given that our relationship dates back to 1888, when we first started sponsoring excavations and receiving fabulous objects like the gorgeous Hathor capital here. And Chris's work has taken him from archives to archaeological sites and exploring a range of different worlds. And tonight I'm really excited because Chris is going to give us some insights into his publication, Egyptologists Notebooks, in which Chris has been able to dive into all of the different European accounts of the early sites and early explorations of the Nile, and really uncover a lot of lost archaeological sites that have only been recorded within these archives. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Chris tonight. And yeah, take it away, Chris.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. It's great to be back. It would be even greater if I could be really back in Sydney, but that's for the future, perhaps. And for now, it's great to be here. So thanks. Thank you, Candice and Craig, for the invitation to be here this evening, and thanks to you all out there for coming along. This is going to be a kind of whistle-stop tour through some of the highlights of some research that I've been doing over the last couple of years for a book. Egyptologists Notebooks is the name of the book, and it's an illustrated book which has the aim in general of telling the story of the history of Egyptology. The word Egyptology wasn't even coined until the middle of the 19th century, so it would have been an unfamiliar word to a lot of the people featured in this book. But it's the story of how explorers, travelers, people from all kinds of backgrounds from Europe came to visit Egypt from the 17th century onwards, as far as the book is concerned anyway, the characters in the book, to see the sites and monuments in Egypt, to study them, to document them, to reveal them, and how Egyptology came into being from this, and so in that sense it's a kind of the story of how we know what we know about ancient Egypt, but it's also a story of how those sites and monuments have changed over time. And so the reference in the title of my talk to Lost Egypt is has kind of several layers to it, actually. I suppose ostensibly I'm talking about an ancient Egypt which was sort of to some extent lying beneath the sands or just poking out of the sands until a couple of centuries ago, and was then revealed by these travelers, artists, archaeologists, Egyptologists. But it's also a story, as I say, of how that landscape's changed and how those sites and monuments have changed, and how surprisingly, in some cases, those sites have come to be lost again. We'll deal with that particular point at the end of the talk. But in the meantime, as I say, the book is intended to be a kind of overview of, it's mostly 19th century is the kind of critical period that we deal with here. The book is divided into 30 odd sections, each relating to a particular character. So it's very much a discrete selection of some of the people who seem to me to be the most interesting and important characters in the story. One of the purposes of the book is to be a kind of a showcase of archives and archival documents, drawings, notes, letters, maps, plans, the physical manifestation of this documentation. You know, these things were made for the purposes of capturing information and sharing it with people, but they are themselves now interesting historical artifacts in their own right, and often these drawings, as we'll see, are very beautiful things in their own right as well. So between my editor and I, we really wanted to be able to tell this story, but to tell it very visually as well. So in the course of the talk today, we're just going to look at a selection of the selection of these Egyptologists to give you a kind of an overview of this story. And then we're going to have a look at a couple of the most important themes. So I suspect that there's going to be a few loose ends untied by the time we get to the end of the talk, but there'll be plenty of time for questions. So if you find that any of these themes is sort of leaves you wondering or leaves you wanting questions, then do pop those into the Q&A box. I'll be happy to answer them at the end. So the first character in the book, or the first character in the book to visit Egypt, and the story is one that plays out very much in Egypt. You might think that would be obvious, but a lot of Egyptology, of course, has actually played out in libraries and lecture theatres and laboratories, archives, museums around the world. But this is very much focused on Egypt and the landscape and the sites and monuments, the archaeology in situ in the country. The earliest of our travellers to visit Egypt is a man called George Sand, a British traveller who visited at the beginning of the 17th century. We're not absolutely sure exactly when he was in Egypt, but he published an account, The Relation of a Journey Begun in Anno Domini 1610, which takes in a number of countries, including Egypt. And it's a reasonably sort of short account. He doesn't actually seem to have visited the full extent of the country. He concentrated on the northernmost areas, the Mediterranean coast, city of Alexandria, which of course was the ancient capital of the city from a little way after the time it was founded by Alexander the Great, and then the capital for several centuries. And although its importance within Egypt diminished after the Arab conquest, it remained the major Mediterranean seaport, and so it was the point of access for European travellers to Egypt up until the advent of air travel, in fact. So Alexandria is the point at which all of these travellers arrive, and of course it was a city of very great renown in the ancient world. So he visited Alexandria, he visited what remained of Memphis, he visited the pyramids, which were still very visible, and very much the sort of highlight of any tour. He also seems to have visited a number of other archaeological sites, and the challenge for us here, but also with lots of our other early travellers as well, is in identifying what they describe with the archaeological sites that we recognise now. Sands talks about going to Memphis, the ancient capital city, which, as I say, is just a little way south of Cairo. He mostly here is discussing mummies and what, from his description, are clearly subterranean tombs full of curious antiquities of various kinds. He's clearly in an ancient cemetery. He doesn't name it, And we are aware these days of a number of extremely rich and important cemetery sites in the Memphis region. Giza is one of them. Saqqara is another. Dahshur is another. Those of you who are familiar with this part of the world will know these sites quite well. You might even have visited. As I say, he doesn't name them, but it seems very likely that he was at Saqqara and able freely to wander around the necropolis and to visit tombs and to pick things up and quite possibly take a few souvenirs away with him. What's really eye-opening about this for somebody like me is just this idea that a site which is so rich, but also which has been so extensively excavated and worked over by, yes, archaeologists to this very day, scientific archaeologists, but in days gone by also people with more nefarious aims, and we're talking about tomb robbers, treasure hunters, etc. And these sites over the past 2 or 3 centuries have been largely stripped one way or another of the grave goods in the tombs. But this was a time at which much of that material would still have been intact. And Sand's descriptions are a bit brief, but still they give us a kind of tantalizing picture of what might have been. These early accounts, of course, seem to us rather comical at times, almost, certainly not scientific in the way that we might expect descriptions of ancient sites to be now. And of course, at this early stage, there was very little by way of accumulated knowledge of ancient Egypt and what the meaning of the sites and monuments were. There was no ability to read the ancient Egyptian language at this point. So Sands is left to draw on classical sources, accounts in Greek and to a lesser extent Latin of what Egypt was like in later ancient history, and otherwise to make his own assertions. And this is one of my favorites. You can see on the right hand side here his drawing of the Giza plateau. So it's recognizable, of course, from 3 main pyramids and a couple of satellite pyramids as well, and then the head of the Great Sphinx emerging from the sand. And indeed, the Sphinx was buried up to its neck until the 1830s. So it would still be buried for a good couple of centuries after Sands visited. Now, here's what he tells us about the Sphinx. He says, by a Sphinx, the Egyptians in their hieroglyphics presented an harlot, having an amiable and alluring face, but with all the tyranny and rapacity of a lion exercised over the poor, heartbroken, and voluntarily perishing lover. So as far as he was concerned, the Sphinx was an Ethiopian, he says elsewhere, harlot. So he has the gender wrong and the meaning, as far as we can tell, completely wrong as well. And this, I don't say this just to make fun of Sands. I say it more to emphasize just how little was known about Egyptian culture, sites and monuments, etc. And yet nonetheless, because so little was known in Europe at this time about what there was to be seen in Egypt, an account like Sands is incredibly valuable because he's bringing, albeit flawed by our standards, knowledge. He's bringing huge quantities of knowledge to a population in countries like Britain, which knew almost nothing about what there was to be seen here. So he's really a great pioneer. As I say, the word Egyptology, Egyptologist hadn't been invented and wouldn't be invented for another couple of centuries. And yet, in bringing this knowledge to European audiences, Sands, I think, kind of qualifies as a very early pioneer of our subject. There was still relatively little travel in Egypt over the course of the next couple of centuries. By total coincidence, 2 of the most important later travelers happened to be in Egypt at exactly the same time. One of them is a Danish naval captain, a man called Frederick Norden, who was dispatched by the King of Denmark to Egypt to make a survey. His journey is much more full and comprehensive than Sands was. Like Sands, Norden arrived in Alexandria. He would have travelled across the Egyptian Nile Delta to the region of the capital city, Cairo. And from there, he would have sailed up the Nile and made the journey as far as Aswan, which is at the first cataract of the Nile, a natural rocky barrier in the river. And that represented, in ancient times, the natural southern frontier of the country. So by making that journey, And that becomes established as the sort of definitive way of exploring Egypt, is to take this Nile journey from Cairo to Aswan, taking in all the sites along the way. This in some senses was a comprehensive journey through the greater part of Egypt, as far as its southern frontier. And he's not only more comprehensive and thorough in the ground that he covers, but in the way that he documents it as well. So Norden, as a naval man, was a skilled cartographer, explorer, and documenter of places and geography. So he records exactly where things are, and that's ancient sites and monuments, but also towns and villages as well. And so he creates very detailed maps of the lie of the land in Egypt, raising the bar in terms of the sort of scientific level of the knowledge he was capturing. And his survey takes in sites further south than those that Sands visited. So you can see in the bottom right here an image again of Giza, with the pyramid of recognizably the middle pyramid of Khafra in the background, and the head of the Sphinx again emerging from the sand. Maybe probably a little bit more accurate in terms of the way in which the image of the Sphinx is captured, and yet we can sort of see, if you know your pyramids, you know that these pyramids are probably a little bit too tall and pointy. The Sphinx looks maybe a little bit more European than it really does, perhaps giving away the preconceived ideas about how the human form should be represented on the part of the artist in Norden's party. And this is a better image of his of the Sphinx. If you were at home and you'd never seen any image of the Sphinx before, then you know this would take you a long way forward in understanding what there was there. And yet, to our eyes, knowing, especially somebody like me who spent a lot of time thinking about the Sphinx, looking at the Sphinx, you know that this isn't hardly a sort of photo real capturing of what it really looks like. As I say, Norden, by total coincidence, was in Egypt at the same time as an English clergyman and traveller, a man called Richard Pocock. They actually crossed on the Nile at one point, unaware of who the other was. And it's only later that each of them found that, oh yes, that was Mr. Pocock, or Captain Norden. And Pocock was doing essentially the same thing. He was on a grand tour of the type that Sands was on, but making a comprehensive record of sites and monuments in Egypt. His drawings are sort of highly stylized, and yet in some sense they capture what is to be found. The drawing on the right hand side here is his imagined sort of aerial view looking down on the Valley of the Kings. The Valley of the Kings doesn't really look anything like this, except in as much as it is a desert wadi in the mountains to the west of the ancient city of Thebes, west of modern Luxor, with a distinctive triangular peak at the top, the mountain we call the Gurn, and leading off the wadi in the lower lands, this valley floor, doors leading into the tombs of the kings, and these doors are all depicted here. They're all far too sort of regularly located here, a little bit as though this was a kind of sort of royal necropolis equivalent of a housing development, with nice, neat, regular doors with even spaces in between them. The Valley of the Kings is nowhere near as regular as this in its appearance. So it doesn't quite look right, and yet it captures the essence of what is there. And again, for people at home who would have had very, very little knowledge or awareness of what there was, an account like this of Pocock's, explaining that this is a necropolis of kings and this is what it looks like, would have been very useful. I'm particularly fond of Pocock's drawings of the colossi of Memnon, these two colossal statues of the 18th dynasty king Amenhotep III, which appear to be sort of freestanding in an empty plain here, but actually would have stood in front of that particular king's memorial temple. The temple has more or less vanished, but the statues have remained standing for the last 3,500 years. They're very typically New Kingdom Egyptian style statues, and yet in Pocock's drawings they appear a little bit more as though they were carved in the style of more European, perhaps sort of classical inspired statues with more classical looking facial features, and the legs and arms and the body have a more sort of classical feel to them. It's as though the artists were unable to disabuse themselves of their preconceptions about what statues should look like, rather than just being able to capture what was really there. But again, in showing the essence of what was there, these two colossal statues standing in the middle of the plain, with, in the drawing on the left-hand side, the Theban necropolis in the background with doorways appearing in the hillside, is not entirely wrong. Believe it or not, this man has a huge impact on Egyptology. This is the Emperor Napoleon, who invaded the country towards the end of the 18th century in 1798 as part of his campaign rampaging around the world, trying to take everywhere over. In fact, this was a very deliberate policy of trying to strike a blow against the British and disrupt their trade with India. But Napoleon also hoped to exploit Egypt for its natural resources, add the territory to his ever-expanding empire. He was successful-ish in that he was able to defeat the local army of Mamluk warriors, the governors of Egypt at this time, on behalf of the Ottoman Empire. But in fact, he failed to establish himself there permanently, partly because of opposition from the Brits as well as the Ottoman Empire, and the invasion was eventually scuppered after about 4 years. But what's important for the story of Egyptology is that Napoleon, or somebody on his behalf, was enlightened enough to bring with the expeditionary force, along with thousands of soldiers, a core of a couple of hundred artists and scientists who were there to make a comprehensive description, a survey of what they found in the country. That meant both the natural environment and the built environment, divided into more modern monuments, but also ancient sites and monuments as well. And whatever the aims of the expedition, the description that resulted was a landmark achievement in Egyptology. It's by far and away the most comprehensive survey we have up to this point of sites and monuments. It's by far and away the most accurate. And even though in terms of accuracy, it's been improved on since, it is, as I say, a landmark moment in the history of our story, but it's also an incredibly good record, a kind of snapshot of what Egypt and its sites and monuments were like at a point just over 2 centuries ago, just as Egyptology was about to get going. And Egyptology, archaeology, digging, tourism, all of those things that followed would have a really dramatic effect on the lie of the land in Egypt. Things would be dug up out of the ground, things began to be removed, temples began to be exposed, tarmac roads began to get built, tourist infrastructure began to develop in and around archaeological sites. Everything was transformed, and the Description de l'Egypte is a record of the sort of last point for these sites and monuments before that explosion of modernity. This moment in history is significant not only for that, but because in fact, in some ways, Napoleon's expedition ushered in that era of modernity. As I mentioned, Napoleon's forces were defeated by a coalition of the British, Napoleon's arch enemy, but also the Ottomans, who controlled Egypt up to this point. Egypt was a part of the wider Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman forces joined with the British in removing Napoleon and his troops from the country. The Ottoman forces were led by an Albanian soldier called Muhammad Ali, who we see in the image on the left-hand side here. And Muhammad Ali, in fact, in a matter of a few years after the departure of the French soldiers, came to be the de facto ruler of Egypt. He was still in charge on behalf of the Ottomans, but in reality, he was beginning to develop Egypt as a kind of independent country under his rule, and he was determined that Egypt should modernize rapidly. So he set about modernizing its infrastructure. This meant generating increase in agricultural produce. So there was lots of irrigation, lots of canal building, lots of road building. He also wanted a modern army, which meant lots of training and lots of production of weapons and other military equipment. So lots of munitions factories were being built, factories of this kind and that kind all over the country. So it was kind of modernizing, industrializing in Egypt. And in order to carry out this program of modernization, Muhammad Ali was going to need help from experts from the outside. So he was very encouraging of European visitors and very encouraging of what was left behind of the British and French presence in Egypt, diplomatic and political presence. And so this led to the establishment of political presence headed by a consul, consul general, vice consul, two in particular, acting respectively on the part of the British and the French, who would become very influential. And by the second decade of the 19th century, these posts came to be held on the part of the British by a man called Henry Salt, and on the part of the French by an Italian, but in the employ of the French, Bernardino Drovetti. Both of these two had a great interest in ancient Egypt, in collecting antiquities, which they were doing partly because they were interested themselves, but also partly because the idea of collecting antiquities, which could then be shipped off to the great museums in London, the British Museum, and in Paris at the Louvre, were things that were a way of sort of glorifying the nations back home. And there was a great competitiveness between the two of them. And this led to them accelerating the process of bringing Europeans in who could do the digging and the carrying off of antiquities for them. One of the main characters in this process is another Italian, but operating this time on the part of the British, the famous strongman turned archaeologist Giovanni Battista Belzoni, who in fact came to Egypt to try and sell a technology for irrigation to Muhammad Ali. A whole load of Europeans coming with various sort of technology or inventions to the country at this point to try and make a fortune. And in this regard, Belzoni failed, but as all of the incoming Europeans did, on his way, he visited the consul, Salt, and Salt saw in Belzoni somebody who, even though his irrigation technique had failed to impress Muhammad Ali, was somebody who had engineering skills and might be able to help him in collecting antiquities. So he dispatched Belzoni to Luxor, which by this time was already well established as the most fertile ground for archaeological material and discoveries, to see if he could remove the object on the left-hand side, which is a bust. It's the top half of a statue of Ramesses II from his mortuary temple, connected to his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, which is an object which had attracted the attention of both the British and the French in the past, but nobody had been able to move because it was just too big and heavy. Belzoni managed to accomplish this in a matter of a couple of weeks without apparently too much difficulty whatsoever. It did eventually make its way to London, and the photograph on the left-hand side shows it in the sculpture gallery on the ground floor in the British Museum. And this set Belzoni on a path of doing an awful lot of digging, removing an awful lot of material for Salt and thence to the British Museum, and in fact other collections in Europe as well, but also to, in the process, making a number of discoveries. He is the person responsible for excavating somewhere, sadly the documentation isn't good enough for us to know exactly where, but somewhere at Karnak, this colossal head and arm of a statue of either Thutmose IV or Amenhotep III. People are arguing about that. The rest of that statue is still in Karnak. We can virtually reconstruct it, of course, but physically they're separated by thousands of miles. Belzoni was also who was among the first Europeans to visit the rock-cut temple of Abu Simbel, which is actually a long way further south from that frontier at Aswan that I mentioned earlier, into Nubia, the territory to the south of Egypt. This was a sort of colossal colonial outpost of the early 19th dynasty, which had only been seen for the first time, and documented by a European a few years earlier. And it was completely choked up with sand, and several people had a go at trying to free it from the sand. But again, it was Belzoni who was the first to succeed in doing this, allowing entry to the inside of the temple for the first time, which caused great excitement. And Belzoni wanted to do his own digging as well, and was aware that the classical accounts of the Valley of the Kings described many more tombs, 40 something according to Strabo, than were open and known in the valley in his time. And so he set about digging, and again fairly quickly came upon what we now know is one of the biggest and most spectacular tombs in the whole of the valley, a tomb which he believed was the tomb of a Samuthis. He was unable to read the hieroglyphics. Nobody could read hieroglyphs at this point in the second decade of the 19th century. But nonetheless, this is the discovery he made. We would come to know it as the tomb of Seti I, KV 17. Not only did he make this discovery, which is among the first sort of archaeological discoveries to be made in Egypt at this early stage, but he also actually did quite a good job of documenting it as well. I hinted when I was beginning to talk about Belzoni's archaeology that documentation wasn't great, and so we very often, pretty much always, are in the dark when it comes to exactly what the archaeological context was of a lot of the things he found. We can only really say that colossal statue of Thutmose IV or Amenhotep III comes from Karnak, and if you know Karnak, which is the temple complex devoted to the god Ammon, it's the most important religious complex in ancient Egypt in the south of the country, a little way north of the modern city of Luxor. It is a vast, vast area. And really, we would want to know exactly where this statue was found, not only within the area of Karnak, but also where in the ground as well, whether it's close to the surface or down below. We would want to know where in the stratigraphy of the site it appears. And yet nothing of this was documented at all. We're lucky if we get a journal entry giving us an approximate date. But these excavations were kind of industrial in their scale. Belzoni and others like him had hundreds of men working for them in lots of different places. The concessions, the permits that were granted to people like Belzoni gave him free rein to excavate over huge areas. And the leaders of these expeditions, Belzoni and others like him, were often not even there when these things were being found. So we have lots of reasons to regret that the documentation of these excavations wasn't better. And we don't really have descriptions, drawings, no photographs, of course, at this early time, of the discovery of the tomb of Seti I. But in the way that Belzoni attempted to capture the decoration and the architecture, there was some sense here of the importance of making an accurate, you might almost say, scientific record of what was there. And this is a drawing of his now in the Bristol Museum's galleries and archives in England, of the tomb, still called Samuthis according to the label, but as I say, we know it as the tomb of Seti I, which shows a kind of a section through the tomb, giving you a sense both of the architecture and the decoration at the same time. The drawings aren't perfect, we could improve on them now, but again, when you think about what a relatively low base readers and those back home, people thirsty for this kind of information, would have been at when in terms of what knowledge there already was available. This is really a very good way of conveying a great deal of information and to an audience. So the bar is continually being raised at this point. The drawings of the decoration, and there are many of these in the Belzoni archive in the tomb of Seti I, again, they could be improved on. You can tell that you're looking at a drawing rather than actually at the wall itself, but they're really not too bad. And one thing which is really crucial is that the hieroglyphic signs, the shapes of the signs, are captured pretty accurately to the point where they can be read And if you know your hieroglyphs, you'll know that it is very important that the shapes of the signs are captured accurately. You probably all know that there are dozens and dozens of signs of men, women, gods, dozens of bird signs, and they've all got to be exactly right for you to be able to read the inscription. And an artist drawing something like this, who simply draws a bird, any bird, is going to lose the sense of the meaning of these inscriptions. And Belzoni's drawings are pretty much good enough. They're good enough to be legible, which again is a step up from things that had gone before. Even the drawings in the Napoleonic Description de l'Egypte often don't capture the hieroglyphs to the extent that they can be read. That's an interesting sort of change in the way things were done. Another aspect of what's happening here is that explorations were beginning to go into uncharted territory. So for a very long time, and to some extent even still today, the classic visit to archaeological sites in Egypt takes in the Nile Delta and the Nile Valley as far south as Aswan, as I mentioned. Going further was still a relatively new thing, even into the 1820s and beyond. By this point, though, there was some interest in going much further and penetrating into what is now Sudan. And Frederick Norden, a French Egyptologist, artist, mineralogist actually as well, is one who was a great pioneer of exploration of ancient sites in Sudan. Some of them actually Egyptian sites, in that they were built by the Egyptians, others of them inspired perhaps by Egyptian art and architecture, but actually built by the indigenous kingdom of Kush. Caio and others, many others, were aware that the classical accounts had included descriptions of a city called Meroe, which was clearly a considerable distance further south than Egypt, but it hadn't been identified on the ground until Caio was led to these curious, tall-looking pyramids, which we now know as the cemetery of the kings and queens of Meroe, a little way away from the city itself. The city itself actually wasn't identified for decades after this point, but Caio is the first to assert that these pyramids represent the remains of the ancient city of Meroe. It's in between in the region of the Fifth Cataract, a long, long way down into Sudan, reasonably close to the capital city at Khartoum. And this, as I say, is the Egyptian-inspired product of the Meroitic civilization, the kingdom of Kush. And these pyramids date from roughly the 3rd or 4th century BC down until about the 3rd, 4th century AD. So centuries and centuries worth of curious Meroitic style pyramids relating to the tombs of these kings and queens. And this was the first time, as I say, anybody had really identified these. In some ways, the next great sort of landmark moment for Egyptology is, as you perhaps are already anticipating, the decipherment of hieroglyphs. The great breakthroughs ultimately made by the Frenchman Jean-François Champollion. And in cracking the code, to use the phrase that's often used for this great achievement, Champollion kind of opens the floodgates. Prior to this point, there was a great abundance of sites and monuments and inscribed material of all kinds: temple walls, tomb walls, statues, stelae, etc., etc. And the Egyptians are very fond of leaving inscriptions all over their material, of course, but nobody could make any sense of any of it up until this point. Once that code was cracked, there was a huge quantity of written material, and very much of it, of course, very useful for scholars in trying to understand what had happened in Egyptian history. So these great surveys of sites and monuments, which had been undertaken by the Napoleonic expedition and by others since then, took on a new importance in that suddenly the capturing of hieroglyphic inscriptions accurately was suddenly incredibly important, and offered the opportunity not only for those who were there on the spot in Egypt, but for those back home who could see these drawings or a published form of them. It would allow them to get their teeth into these inscriptions and start to make sense of what the Egyptians were writing down. And Champollion himself only visited Egypt once, a few years after he had made the great breakthrough of the decipherment, and he, along with the Tuscan Ippolito Rossellini, led an expedition of artists, the aim of which was to make a brand new, most comprehensive ever survey of sites and monuments. And one of his most favoured artists was a man called Nestor Lote, who features in the book, who made a number of fantastic drawings of these sites and monuments. Again, some of which no longer exist, making these drawings that bit more valuable to us. The temple on the right, the temple of Amenhotep III, re-inscribed for Seti I, which was at Elephantine, no longer exists anymore. A Scot who was attempting to do something similar in creating a comprehensive survey of sites and monuments is Robert Hay. Robert Hay's story looms large over Egyptology in that it's well known within the subject to specialists that his drawings, made by himself, but also a number of artists he employed, are among the best that had been made up until this point. And he gathered a huge quantity of material over the course of a number of years and several expeditions, and yet he never published it. And the archive is now in the British Library. Hay was actually one of the first people I had in mind when I set about beginning to gather material for this project. And his was the first archive that I went to look at. And in the British Library, there are something like 60 folios. So that's a kind of huge folder with individual drawings pasted onto the pages. So there's something like 60 folios, and those folios in some cases contain well over 100 drawings each, and that's to add to the textual material, his journal, letters, etc., etc. It's absolutely vast, this archive, and in fact it almost gave me a minor nervous breakdown, because I was trying to put together a book of between 30 and 50 sections, each relating to somebody like Robert Hay, for whom I would need to select the best 8 to 10 images, something like that. And already I was looking at getting literally hundreds of fabulous and beautiful and previously unpublished drawings together for this book. So it was in some ways an extremely difficult and frustrating process having to pare this archive down. But nonetheless, I'm very pleased to have been able to give some exposure to these drawings, many of which have never been seen before. As I say, Hay's well known to Egyptologists, and his drawings I have been researched by a number of people over the years, but they've never really been published. I could have done a book on Hay alone, and perhaps that's something for the future. His drawings, as with so many of these drawings at the time, as I keep saying, show the sites and monuments in the condition in which they were to be found at this relatively early date. And this is a view from within the first court of the Temple of Edfu, the Temple of Horus at Edfu, a little way to the south of Luxor, in between Luxor and Aswan. And what you can see is that there are column capitals either side, sort of framing this image. And of course, the columns are very tall. We're sort of talking 20 or 30 meters high. And we are at that height here, but standing on the level of the modern ground. The reason being that the temple has been filled up with an accumulation of debris and dust and sand and detritus. Actually, a lot of that is the product of modern occupation. And you might be able to see, just looking into the court, that within the squared area, surrounded on all sides by further columns, there are smaller buildings, or the remains of smaller buildings. What had happened over the centuries, from the time the temple was in use in ancient times, is that these buildings were appropriated and reused, often as places where people lived or had shops or marketplaces, or they kept animals. And over the years, these buildings and that activity had all built up. So at this point, with all of that accumulation having developed over centuries and centuries, you have an incredibly rich archaeological situation where you've got centuries and centuries worth of evidence of human activity. What happened in the 19th century in the years following this, mostly in the second half of the 19th century, is that these temples were all cleared so that they could be, the ancient architecture could be revealed. And of course, we are now able, and it's entirely wonderful, to be able to walk around temples like this. Edfu is one of the very best preserved, probably the best preserved in the whole of Egypt. But at the same time, all of that evidence of other life, human activity from centuries and centuries, was lost in an instant. And these drawings like this one preserve a snapshot of what Egypt was like and what these temples were like at this particular point. And because, of course, it was considered to be much more important to reveal the ancient Ptolemaic temple, in this case, or New Kingdom temple elsewhere, all of this later activity just wasn't considered important. So it was all cleared away and not really documented properly. And that makes these drawings incredibly important. James Burton was a contemporary of Hayes. He was the first to enter a number of tombs in the Valley of the Kings, made important records which wouldn't be improved on for a very long time. He arrived in Egypt as a kind of ne'er-do-well, but once there, took it upon himself to copy the decoration and architecture in sites and monuments. This is an image actually from the tomb of Seti I, discovered by Belzoni, on the right-hand side here. Again, the level of his drawings is helping raise the bar again. By the time of the middle of the 19th century, there's become an awareness of the importance not just of excavating sites like crazy and removing statues and pretty things to museums, but in preserving the sites as well. And an important development occurred with the arrival in Egypt of an Armenian geologist working on behalf of the British geologist Joseph Horner. This is a man called Joseph Hekekian, whose principal interest was in establishing, this might not sound terribly exciting, but the rate of deposition of silt and natural accumulation in the Nile Valley area. But in order to measure the rate of accumulation, he was using archaeological remains, such as the base of a colossal statue of Ramesses the Great at Memphis, as a kind of a benchmark, knowing that the statue of Ramesses II must have been erected in his time, and that therefore the ground underneath at the level of the base of the statue would be the ground level in the 19th dynasty. And then all he's got to do is observe the sediments above that to assess the rate of accumulation of debris. And as I say, his interest in this is in geology, but in recording the sediments like this, he's doing an enormous service to archaeology. And his approach, a very scientific approach, and his way of capturing the data was really something that was entirely new for Egyptology. And in fact, Hekekian was way ahead of his time. And much as his work was examined by geologists in the middle of the 19th century, it was pretty much ignored by archaeology and Egyptology. He was unknown until a colleague of mine, David Jeffries, the director of the Survey of Memphis in the 1980s and 90s, began to look again at this material and found that, wow, almost 150 years earlier, Hekekian was doing exactly the kind of fusion of environmental geological studies and archaeology that has now become de rigueur on archaeological sites. And his drawings are a revelation as well. They're these huge, he used very large pieces of paper, and he used every last part of that paper too. So not only do we have his very detailed maps, but then when there's a spare bit of paper up at the top here, he inserts an image of an obelisk, and then he writes again in a different direction here, making use of every spare space. Everything is taken up. I'm very grateful to the publisher of my book for agreeing that these drawings should be published in full as foldouts, which are very expensive for publishers, but it was really the only way we could capture the full extent of these drawings to do that. So, and again, they've hardly ever been seen publicly before, so I'm really pleased that we were able to include these. Hekekian, by the way, is the discoverer of not the colossal statue that's in its own museum in Memphis now, but the one that for many years stood outside the main railway station in Cairo. And the statue gave its name to the square outside the railway station Midan Ramses Square. It's now been moved. It was actually moved more than 10 years ago to the site of the new Grand Egyptian Museum, but then sort of was effectively in kind of storage while the museum was built. But now the museum has more or less been built. It is the main object, if you like, that you see when you enter the museum. As you can see, this is the great entrance hall here, and Hekekian's Ramses statue is right in the center. During the latter part of the 19th century, as mass tourism began to get going in Egypt, a much greater sort of section of European society was able to visit Egypt. And in the 19th century, there's a number of women who come to have a very great impact on Egypt. Chief among them, perhaps Amelia Edwards, the artist and writer who became a great promoter of the preservation of Egyptian sites and monuments, founder of the Egypt Exploration Society. And she was also the creator of the first chair, the first teaching position in Egyptian archaeology in the UK at UCL, the Edwards Chair. There is still an Edwards professor to this day. She was traveling on the Nile at the same time as Marianne Brocklehurst, another traveler, collector of antiquities, diarist, who made a great record of sites and monuments in Egypt, and managed to capture one or two important moments in the discovery of material. She includes a couple of fabulous drawings of the discovery of the Bab al-Gassus tomb, which contained hundreds of coffins of priests of Ammon of the 21st dynasty. So she was on the spot in the right time and making a record of that. Howard Carter, of course, is somebody skipping forwards in time that I couldn't ignore, partly because of his impact on Egyptian archaeology. He was the discoverer of the tomb of Tutankhamun, of course. What's less well known about Carter is that at the point he discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun, he'd been working in Egypt for around about 30 years, having originally arrived not as an archaeologist, but as one of these artists who was tasked with recording the decoration in tombs. And his principal skill was as an artist and draftsman, and that would serve him very well when he came to document the objects in the tomb. And he left behind a great archive of drawings, some of the earlier of which are not nearly so well known as his Tutankhamun exploits. And this great painting of a scene of Thutmosis I and his wife Senseneb from the Temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari is in the archives of the Egypt Exploration Society. His first work in Egypt was for the Egypt Exploration Society. When I worked there, this was hanging on the wall in the office, and it's very difficult to photograph. It's behind glass and it's very large. I'd had a go on several occasions at trying to take good pictures of it over the years, but I am no pro photographer. So I'm delighted that for this book, we had a professional photographer from the British Library come to make a good photo of it at last. And that is included in the book. The same day, the ES archives are a very rich source of material of the kind that we wanted to use in the book. And a favourite character of mine from Egyptian archaeology is the director of the EES's Amarna excavations from the 1930s, a man called John Pendlebury. He was a specialist in the archaeology of Crete and also of Egypt. He was curator of the Palace of Minos at Knossos and also director of the EES excavations. And as you can see from the photo on the right hand side, not a shy man. Certainly a kind of showman archaeologist, and somebody who rather more seriously took the idea of conveying the results of serious archaeological work to the wider public very, very seriously. As far as he was concerned, if the results of what he was doing in the field weren't being made known to the public, then there was no point. Archaeology should stop, he more or less says at one point. And his excavations actually are probably better documented and better represented in the EES archives than any other. And that's, I think, at least partly because of how strongly he felt about the importance of capturing things so that the stories of what he was finding could be told to the people back home and around the world. He also had a multifaceted team of specialists, and inevitably one of the stories in the book is of how we tend to know about expedition leaders, expedition directors, and we tend most often to know about the people whose names went on the front of publications. Pendlebury is the person in the case of the Amarna project whose name goes on the front of the publication. But he had a great team of various people with various different skills who contributed enormously, in particular to the documentation process. And those include architects, archaeologists, yes, of course, but also architects, artists. The ES even dispatched its secretary, assistant secretary to the project at one point, initially to just look after the books and to manage the finances and the administration of the dig. But she, Mary Chubb, ends up doing a lot of archaeological work as well, as did John Pendlebury's wife. And she is responsible for this glorious coloured drawing of a decorated stone lintel belonging to a man called Hearty Eye. And this is another thing which had been in the ES archives for a very long time, but more or less hidden away. It was rolled up. Again, very difficult to photograph, but again, we managed to get it photographed for this book, and I'm really pleased to have been able to make a bit of a splash of the work of the lesser known members of Pendlebury's team, including his very own wife, Hilda, who, as I say, is the artist of this drawing. Another sort of slightly lesser known part of the story that I wanted to give a bit of exposure to was the Egyptian side of things. And I think many of us are increasingly aware of the influence of the political situation on Egyptology, and the fact that a lot of the archaeology and Egyptology which was undertaken by Europeans in Egypt was enabled and encouraged by some rather unhappy events, such as Napoleon's expedition and the British presence, the British bombardment of Egypt from 1882 onwards. And from that year on, Egypt was essentially a kind of British protectorate up until the 1950s. We tended to sort of disregard this, I think, trying to concentrate on the ancient sites and monuments, but we have to be aware of this and of the impact of these political machinations on the Egyptian people and the sort of appropriation of their heritage for European purposes. And a part of that story, or a part of the way we might begin to understand all the ins and outs of that story a bit better, is to shine a light on the Egyptian contribution. And part of the reason that's been a bit difficult up to now is that, you know, the focus has all been on European and other mostly Western archaeologists and scholars. But it's also because the archives of the kind that are on display in this book for Egyptian archaeologists, Egyptologists and others are much less well known. They're not so accessible. They haven't been the subject of the same research. But I wanted, as far as possible, to include Egyptian archives in this. And there's only one section on an Egyptian Egyptologist, and that's a man called Hassan Effendi Hosni, whose story we are able to tell much better now, thanks to the discovery just a few years ago of a vast archive of administrative papers, correspondence, journals, daybooks, archaeological documentation, which was found in a locked room in the Seti temple at Abydos by a group of Ministry of Antiquities inspectors. Most of this material has still never even been looked at yet because there's just far too much of it. But a conservation and research project is now underway at the temple, and already some of these stories are beginning to emerge, and I'm delighted, absolutely standing on their shoulders, to have been able to include Hassan Hosni. I wrote a little something about colonialism and its impacts in Egypt for my website at the time the book was coming out last year, so as to kind of explain what I meant about all of this, and that's available on my website if you want to know more about that. I'm aware that I'm overrunning, but unless Candace or Craig want to jump in and throw me out, I'm just going to take a few more minutes to talk about Lost, Found and Lost Again, if that's okay. If I don't get switched off, then I'll take it that it is okay. Okay, great, thanks. We were talking about overrunning beforehand. We were having an overrunning competition, and I think I'm the winner. Anyway, in terms of going over time. Anyway, So I mentioned at the start, you know, and I've mentioned several times during the talk, that the value of a lot of these archives is in, you know, yes, they're a record of the development of our subject, and yes, many of these drawings in particular are just very beautiful objects, the kind of things you might almost want to have hanging on your wall above the fireplace. But they also, importantly, capture Egypt at a particular moment in time, some of them before archaeology, treasure hunting, tourism, all those things we've been talking about really got going and had a huge impact, changing the landscape. And I think from an archaeological point of view, we sometimes tend to think that archaeology is about revealing things. It's about you know, there being ancient remains on the ground which somehow come to be hidden, they get buried or obscured for whatever reason, and the heroic archaeologist comes along and reveals it. And then we've got it, great, we've got it back, and we have it forever, and we can all live happily ever after. What is unexpected about the story, at least of some of these ancient sites and monuments in Egypt, is that yes, they had survived in the ground, sometimes exposed, sometimes hidden. They were documented for the most part for the first time, at least in terms of this sort of European endeavors and interests from the beginning of the 19th century onwards. But rather than these things then being revealed and then us all living happily ever after, as I say, some of these things then subsequently disappeared. And now don't exist at all, which runs completely contrary to our idea of what's really supposed to be going on here. We're supposed to find these things and then be really pleased about it and keep these things forever, but actually in some cases they've disappeared. So I talked already about the fact that in some places like Edfu, and here also we're looking at the entrance to the Luxor temple, we can see another temple completely or sort of half full of debris, which is the product of centuries of accumulation of the evidence of human activity. As at Edfu in Luxor in the second half of the 19th century, in the 1870s, I think, this was all cleared away, almost all cleared away. So the houses, shops, pigeon towers that you can see just in between the pylon here, perhaps if you're eagle-eyed, these are all stripped away and not really documented properly, except that they appear incidentally in drawings like this one and the occasional photograph from later on. So there's that element of things that gets lost. But in some cases, we're talking about almost entire archaeological sites. And this is the city of Antinopolis, named after Hadrian's great favorite, Antinous. It was founded by Hadrian after Antinous's death. He died nearby. This is in Middle Egypt. As you can see from this drawing, this is from the Napoleonic Description. There was a great colonnaded street running through the center of the city. The mounds either side of it are the remains of the rest of the city. There's in fact a perpendicular street running, so there's a kind of crossroads in the center of the town. Out in the distance, there's the remains of some kind of stadium, hippodrome. There was a theatre, monumental, with a monumental entrance. There was a triumphal arch. The ground plan was captured quite nicely by the savants, and in fact is still sort of visible in satellite images. That's the same shape there. And the remains of the hippodrome are just about visible too. But as you can see, the modern town nearby has begun to encroach, and in fact hardly any of that city is still standing now. Almost everything we've just been looking at in the drawings is now gone for one reason or another. This great portico of the time of Alexander the Great at the site of Hermopolis, which was documented by Vivant de Nantes during the Napoleonic expedition, this is now gone. This is a temple of Antiopolis, close to the site of Gao el Kabir, which was recognizable in classical texts, identified on the ground. This was washed away by the River Nile a few years after this drawing was made, again by the Napoleonic savants. 18 columns were standing in 1813. By 1817, only one was left. This is a building of the famous Cleopatra at Armant. It's a birth house in which she is depicted in the form of a goddess, and her son Kaisarion, her designated successor, appears as the god, the great god, sort of Horus, being born into the world. This was dismantled in 1861 so that the masonry could be used for the construction of a sugarcane factory. So this doesn't exist at all. The same is true of this temple of Khnum at Esna. These are drawings by a man called Jean-Jacques Riffaut. The temple of Contralatopolis, which is opposite Esna, again doesn't exist anymore. And this is the temple of Amenhotep III, which we saw in a drawing by Nestor Lote, which again was destroyed, in this case in 1822. Again, the masonry used for the construction of a modern building on the other side of the river in the city of Aswan. So the modernization of Egypt brought archaeologists and travelers and explorers to the country to document things. But surprisingly at this point, actually, it sort of brought about a period of great loss of archaeology as well. And just to conclude, I did a little bit of work on one site in particular, which caught my attention while I was doing my research for this book. I saw drawings like this one, several drawings, which caught my attention. One of the things which I found a little bit tricky at times in looking at these archives is that the names that are used to describe them are not always the names that we recognize today. So particularly from the period before hieroglyphs could be read, when it was impossible to identify sites and monuments by their builders because nobody could read the names. A lot of them have more sort of antique sounding names. So the building we would now refer to as the Memorial or Mortuary Temple of Ramesses II, the Ramesseum, was prior to that associated with a legendary king of the Homeric poems, Memnon, and therefore called the Memnonian. And most of the time, I'm on top of this sort of stuff. So when I see an arcane name for something, I'm usually able to say what it is. And you know, of course, I'm reasonably familiar with what these sites and monuments look like as well. So I could usually visually identify things. But this particular thing, which appears in a drawing here of James Burton now in the British Library, caught my attention because it seemed to be enormous and complicated. And it was referred to in some cases as the Baths of Cleopatra in Alexandria. I had no idea what this was, and I began to think, is this something that has come to be lost? It was recorded by a number of people in the early 19th century, and then it just doesn't seem to appear in archives after this point. I don't know what it is. I spoke to several people who also had no idea what it was. In fact, I was unable to solve this mystery in time for the book. So I had to sort of set it on one side. I didn't want to be admitting in print that this was something I just didn't know about. But once the book was out, I came back to it. And it turns out, as I began to look into it, that lots of people indeed had looked at this. This is a drawing of the same monument by a man called Luigi Meyer, who was in Egypt at the very end of the 18th century. His Views in Egypt was published in 1801. This is a drawing from a little later by Hector Horot, which is labeled Bath of Cleopatra. To cut a long story short, I discovered that this is not, the monument is not anything to do with bathing. It is, as I suspected from the beginning, a monumental tomb. It's in the district of Necropolis, the ancient cemetery of Ptolemaic Alexandria. I have an interest in lost tombs, and in particular in the tombs of Alexander the Great and Cleopatra. I wondered if it could be this. I'm sure actually it's not, but I still don't know for sure if it exists or not. I think I've identified the location in Google Earth. So this might be a monument that was lost, found, lost again, or maybe not. And I need to get back to Egypt to find out for sure. This is something else I wrote about on my website, if you'd like to go and have a look at that. And with that, and with apologies for overrunning, and thanks for your patience, I will conclude. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. I must say, you can overrun any time when you've got images of that quality. That was extraordinary. So thank you. I know some people may need to head off to other things. I know we've got a few people from the UK who've joined us, but anyone who can stay, I will invite you to ask any questions. We'll keep it a little bit short just because we have gone over time, but please add a question to the Q&A. One thing, just while people are adding into that function, I just wanted to say, well, firstly, in amongst your rogues gallery of people, two in particular, that I just want to say I'm pleased you mentioned. One is Richard Pocock, because he spent quite a fair bit of time in Cyprus as well, and I've used his diaries and his publication quite a lot. But also from the Chau Chak Wing Museum's perspective, Joseph Hekekian, because of course he was in Egypt at the same time as Sir Charles Nicholson, the founder of our collection, and is responsible for finding the limestone tallet block, which is on display in the museum currently, not open to the public at the moment because of the lockdown. But so it's interesting, you know, again, just within this broader context of how the material spreads around. And I'll mention it a little bit later on as well, but of course our exhibition Pharaonic Obsessions, which Candice has curated and is very modest, but it's a brilliant exhibition, even if I say so. But of course, you know, some of those stories that you see, that you've talked about tonight, we see repeated in the materiality, particularly because of the connections with the Egyptian Exploration Society in this case. But the question I was going to ask you, and you did touch upon this actually, particularly when you were talking about Hosni, but of course, now that we are in an era where we are trying to decolonize archives and libraries and museum collections and so on, you know, that challenge to actually find contemporary Ottoman voices and contemporary Egyptian voices that might have a different narrative from the European men and women who were traveling into Egypt. How is that progressing? Are there Egyptian scholars who are attempting to find more and more records like the Hosni research that's taking place?
Yes, thanks. I'm really glad you asked that question. Yes and no. The Seti Temple archive is really extraordinary. It's massive. Nobody knew it was there, or at least, you know, certainly if anybody knew, then they were keeping it to themselves. As I understand it, you know, this was a bit of this very labyrinthine temple which was locked and had been forgotten about, and it's very common for monuments like that to be used, or sort of corners of them to be used as secure storage facilities. Tombs are often used as kind of lock-up, you know, informal magazines for archaeological objects. And this archive is absolutely huge. But so the fact that it is now being conserved and researched is kind of an accident. We know that there are archives elsewhere in Egypt, but they often, you know, awareness of them is not great. They're often not very well. They're often not in a sort of condition where anybody can go and look at them. There's often a sensitivity around, particularly government records, for obvious reasons. You know, the institution that has looked after sites and monuments in Egypt since the middle of the 19th century is an Egyptian government department. So much of the Egyptian archive that tells that story that you referred to, the story that we kind of really need to hear to redress that balance, is our government papers, and there's a lot of sensitivity around allowing that out. And that in Egypt, that kind of research is still developing. But I think the more of these stories that can be told, the more there's going to be an awareness of the huge benefits of telling them. And I hope that's going to lead to a growing awareness within Egypt of the importance of looking after these collections and making them available for researchers. I don't want that to sound like a criticism, because Egypt has absolutely got its hands full with, you know, one of the world's great, most richest collections of archaeological material anywhere, you know, and it struggles for resources naturally. So to sort of be implying that, you know, they really ought to suddenly magic up the the manpower and finances to look after archives as well, when everybody is struggling for that, is a bit rich. But it is true that is a part of the issue, and I would have loved to include more of those kinds of archives in the book. And the truth is that there's very, very little available. So there can't be more. That sounds like a lame excuse, but it's much easier to get hold of material elsewhere, sadly.
Yeah. Maybe a volume 2 in due course. Now, there's some fantastic questions that come through. I'll try and get through as many as I can. A lot of comments about hay in particular, and a number of Scottish listeners as well. But general consensus, and I would add to this one as well, but Morag in particular asking, are you intending to produce a book on Hay himself? And then also a question as to whether Hay used photography at all.
Great questions, thanks. And so just to deal with the first one, I'd love there is actually a biography of Hay, which was written by a man called Selwyn Tillett, who studied Hay in the archive for a master's degree at Cambridge, I think, in the 1980s. So in some ways, the book has been written. The problem, again, I don't mean to imply criticism, it's not illustrated, so you don't get any of that sense of these incredibly beautiful drawings. But the fact that a biography exists, I think, to some extent, has perhaps put people off, producing a new book. I think, I mean, another issue here, again, and it might sound like a lame excuse, but it is very expensive to publish lavishly illustrated books, which means that the books have to be expensive to buy, and that means they don't always work as, in terms of the economics of publishing. So I am very grateful to my editor for allowing me to include as much material as I could in this book. A book only on Hay, I think, much as clearly Morag and you and I and lots of other people as well would love there to be one, and can see that there's enough material. Persuading a publisher to put up the money for it might be a bit tricky. Having said that, there is a PhD student at the University of Southampton at the moment called Gemma Renshaw, and her PhD is based on that archive. So I'm cautiously optimistic that when she finishes, her work might get published in the form of a book, and that there might be a way of including a number of the illustrations in that, because it would merit it. About photography, Hay's basically too early to have used it. So he was mostly in Egypt in 2 stints in the 1820s and into the first couple of years of the 1830s. And photography wasn't really in use until later. I think the first to make use of it at all in the book is Hector Horo, who's the person who drew the very first image in the presentation. He wasn't reproducing photographs, but he was using them as a basis for his drawings. But yeah, Hay's a bit early for that.
Bit early. But keeping the theme of photography, there's actually been a couple of comments have come through just then of people would actually love to pay for an archival book of antique photographs as well. And Lisa actually asks if you looked at some of the earlier photographers, such as Maximin Ducamp and Francis Firth, and points out how it's interesting to compare some of the early photographs of the sites with early illustrations as well.
Yeah, great question. Thanks. The project was really to focus on other kinds of material. We really wanted primarily drawings and paintings. Having said that, there are photographs in the book, and absolutely right, it is very interesting, and there is a great abundance of incredibly important photographs out there. There are a number of books actually that have appeared of early photographs of Egypt. There's lots of editions of Frith's work and others, Tynard, Maxime Ducamp, etc. I have looked at them when looking at specific sites, so for example, I did a little bit of work on the birth house of Cleopatra at Armant, which was something that was photographed by a number of people in the 1850s. You may remember this is the building that was torn down in 1861, so there are photographs of it, and in fact they show it to be more or less in the same situation as it was at the various points in history when various people had drawn it. But yeah, I mean, the photographs they become essential, and in fact, of course, photography eventually kills some parts of the drawing side of the process. But so yeah, for the purposes of this book, our focus was on other things, but there are photos in the book, and once it becomes established, it's indispensable.
Yeah. Look, some interesting questions, and we won't get time to get through everything, unfortunately. But one that points out that given that so many of the early Egyptologists and so many of the early expeditions were actually destroying almost as much as they were preserving as well, is there a way of moving forward in terms of trying to reconstruct or recreate some of the material which we know would have been there because of illustrations and descriptions at the time, but are physically not anymore? And the question is asking, is restoration one of the answers, or rebuilding?
Oh, that's a good question. I think maybe this is I'm not a conservator, and I'm not I'm not somebody who works directly in that sort of field, restoration of monuments. It does happen. It is happening. Personally, I think a lot of us, I'm not alone in this, I think prefer a more sort of minimal intervention. So for me, what's important about the archives is that they allow us to understand to some extent what was there. I think trying to put it back physically is a mistake, and in fact for me that is the mistake that has been made in the past, in the approach, particularly in the latter half of the 19th century, but into the 20th century as well, was to say, okay, there was a really great temple here, let's say an 18th dynasty temple. Wow, that must have been amazing, isn't it? A shame it's fallen down. So what we should do is put it back.
Yeah.
And actually what happens in that process often, because sites aren't a case of a single moment in time where they were sort of built and finished and brand new, and then everything that happens afterwards isn't important. Actually, we can't know this in all the nitty-gritty details, but I suspect that a lot of the time Egyptian monuments were not finished. Well, we know they weren't a lot of the time, but I suspect that even perhaps happened more than we realized. They weren't quite finished, but then there was a change of plan, and actually this wasn't finished, but then they built that bit, and then that was torn down, and then they put that on, and then this kind of accidentally grew up. So when you're restoring things, you sort of have to have in mind, okay, we're going to restore to this point, and that sort of papers over all of that complexity. So for me, I think if I was the king of the world, I think I'd prefer to sort of leave things be, but to put the emphasis on to explaining in other ways, virtually, through archives, whatever, visitor centers, how things would have been. And there's a couple of places in Egypt, think of all those temples. You can probably tell from what I was saying that where houses and shops and places where people lived, mosques, churches, can you believe that churches that were in some cases as much as almost 2,000 years old, or monasteries, were removed from archaeological sites because they weren't old enough?
Yeah.
It seems astonishing, doesn't it? If we could go back in time now and have our time again, I think a lot of us would be saying, well, just stop. There's got to be better ways of finding out what everything is and what it looked like, but let's not tear down the cathedral. you know, because we prefer the 18th dynasty. Yeah.
Well, of course, the loss becomes part of the historical narrative too, doesn't it? So, you know, for us to come along in the 21st century and to insert is a falsification of that narrative.
Yeah, I often think, sorry, if I may, I often think that we are guilty. I'm sure I've been guilty of this in the past, of thinking that archaeology is like the end of the process. That's it. And you draw a line and then nothing happens after that. And you're exactly right. The archaeology is itself an intervention and it's part of the history.
A couple of comments about just going back to Hayes, a few suggestions, perhaps a website or digital publication of the archives might be a compromise as opposed to a full-scale book. But also based upon your comments just then, quite a few people commenting upon 3D visualizations and of course other forms of visual technologies in terms of recreating the structures, which is what you suggested yourself just then as well, and has really been a game changer for archaeology in the past 2 decades, really. But yeah, many of these sites would really benefit from that. But this leads quite nicely into a question from Robert, an old colleague of mine as well, who questions to what extent are all of these archives being digitized. The book, of course, is a fantastic resource for all of us, but in terms for other researchers, are there any intentions for any of these individual archives to be digitized? I know the EES has done amazing work of getting much of their archives online, but in terms of, you know, how much borrowing into libraries and archives did you have to do, and how much will be easier for future researchers?
Wow, that's a really good question as well. Thank you. Yeah, a lot of, I mean, I think we're somewhere along the line. So you're right, the EES has done amazing things. But I can say from experience that it's, and I'm sure that you will know this, Craig, and lots of others will too, it's an incredibly resource heavy thing to do to digitize material. Obviously, you have to, that material has to be handled very carefully. There is not really any way around the manual nature of the work. You know, carefully remove drawing from folio, place on scanner, or, you know, place in a position where it can be photographed. You know, the EES has done great work, as you say, but actually those larger drawings just defeated us while I was there, and the only way that those two things, there's only two, could be captured was to get in for a day a British Library photographer, and I don't think there's any way that we would normally have had the resources to pay for that. It's been paid for in this case because there's commercial publication, you know, on the back of it. I mean, somewhere like the British Library has digitized a lot of its material, but what they are tending to do, as I'm sure is the case in a lot of places, is digitize things as people ask for them. But the quantity that's, or the proportion that's been digitized, I don't know this, but I suspect is still quite small. So from the point of view of my research, I was able to do a lot of work on, for example, the collection from the EES remotely, digitally. In the case of most of the British Library material, and in fact, the British Library is the biggest single source of material for this book. Robert Hay, Pocockian, James Burton, Banks, Edward William Lane. Those are all huge, rich, incredible archives. The majority of those things have not been digitized. The other thing is that there's a difference, I think, between sort of capturing an image which works from a research point of view and then capturing an image which will work from the point of view of publication, reproduction and publication. And it's all just really time consuming and expensive. And, you know, even a big, relatively well-funded and important institution like the British Library can't just, you know,
do everything.
Conjure up the resources to do it just like that. So it's happening. But yeah, we're slowly.
Two very quick questions to wrap up, and my apologies to anyone who's asked a question and I just have not had a chance to get through it. But one is, commenting that obviously it's very difficult to include all of the Egyptologists at the period of time that the book covers. But was there any particular rationale for choosing the individuals that you have done? And the person mentions a couple of people that you didn't refer to tonight. And but I mean, I'm assuming access to archives is perhaps one of the rationales behind it, but was there a reason why you chose some travellers and scholars and not others?
Yeah, there were lots of reasons actually. So I wanted to be able to some extent to tell the story of Egyptology from a certain beginning point. So, you know, earliest European travellers up until a certain point. The last in the book is a man called Brian Emery, who died in 1971, started working in Egypt in the early 20s, but died in 1971. So he's the only, I conclude actually the book by, or that section by saying, as far as I know, he's the only person in the book who anyone still alive knew. So in that sense, there's a sort of connection that brings us up to today. So I needed that sort of chronological range. Secondly, and this is just a very practical consideration, there had to be beautiful illustrated material that could go in the book. So when people have asked me this question before, I often say, well, that Auguste Mariette, who's the Frenchman who made a string of incredible discoveries, founded the Antiquities Service, founded the National Collection of Antiquities, is a giant in our field. He's not in the book because we don't have archive material for him. A lot of his notebooks and journals were in the basement of the Boulac Museum, where the National Collection was housed, and it was flooded in the 1880s, I think. And a lot of that material was just lost. And then we wanted not to fall back on all the characters that you already know. So I wanted there to be some more obscure names in there, some less well-known names. We wanted to include material that had never been published. I was also under instructions from my publisher that we had to include certain of the best-known names. So Flinders Petrie has to go in, Howard Carter has to go in. And then I really wanted to try to prioritize women, because actually, you know, that's a side of the story that probably hasn't been told to the extent that it should be, because there were a number of extremely influential women in Egyptology, particularly in the later years of the 19th century, and then also Egyptians. And in some ways, I feel as though you know, the book goes some way to achieving those aims, but not all the way. And that is partly because, lastly, and this again will perhaps sound like a lame excuse, but we to some extent had to go for low-hanging fruit. The material had to be accessible. It had to be easily enough accessible. There are, of course, considerations like reproduction fees to pay. And, you know, it isn't the case that there's just a limitless budget for things like this. So all those things went into the melting pot, and this is the book that came out. And, you know, I hope it does a decent enough job against all those initial aspirations. But if nothing else, I can say that the original shortlist of names for the book was something we originally agreed on, something like 52 sections, and it ended up being 32, just because from very early on in the process it was really clear that I was going to write more text than they wanted, and I was going to want to include more images than they wanted. So we just had to reduce. I
imagine as you're going through the archives and finding those wonderful illustrations, you're going, there's no way this cannot go in as well, isn't there?
Well, yeah, and honestly, I mean, as I was saying, the Robert Hayes situation almost stopped me in my tracks, because I knew it was a big archive, but I you know, having seen it, I just thought, how can I, you know, how can I distill this story into 1,000 words, 2,000 words, which was 2,000 was already too many, and you know, and I don't know how many hundreds of drawings. You know, how can I do this? I just had to, you know, I just had to get on with it and do it, and put all of those reservations on one side, and hope that people will enjoy what's in the book and want to take their interest further, even though the book doesn't allow them to do that to the extent that I would like.
Now, look, there are many other questions. I will actually send them to you later on, because I think there's some people that you will know who have put in comments, and many people saying how much they've enjoyed the talk as well. But I will remind listeners that if you do actually have a question for Chris, Chris's website, chrisnorton.com, is does have an opportunity for people to contact you to ask questions, and is a wonderful resource in its own right as well. So the final question I'm going to ask you tonight is, someone has asked that if you could time travel, if you could jump in a TARDIS, of all the Egyptologists you've spoken about today, whose expedition would you most like to join?
Wow, that's a good question. I'm torn between. I think my main motivator would be to go and see the places that they were seeing before they changed. You know, you can probably tell that's become a major, my sort of main preoccupation in all of this is just how much Egypt has changed. So if I could join the Hay expedition, then part of the thing about the Hay expedition is that the 1820s was a time when so much was happening, and so many of these archives were produced by people then, and they all knew each other. So the Hay expedition was probably doing arguably the best work. But if I was a part of that team, I'd get to go and hang out at John Gardner Wilkinson's house and meet everybody, and I could maybe go and visit the tombs that people were not only recording but also hammering out the decoration from, so it'd be a chance to go and see decoration while before it was hacked off the walls and taken to museums and all that kind of thing. And a much less spoilt landscape. I think that's what I'd really like to be able to go and see. So 1820s Robert Hay.
I personally would love to see Belzoni's circus act.
Yes,
just to see how he did it. But on that note, I think, many of the people who've joined us tonight, of course, know you both from the tours you've led and obviously through television documentaries and your other appearances in your books. But this has been a wonderful evening for those of us in Australia, and for those of us joining in from around the world as well. No matter what time of day you're listening in, what an evocative journey into the past as well. So it's been a real privilege. Thank you, Chris. For people listening in, the Chau Chak Wing Museum, of course, we are closed for the duration of the current Sydney lockdown. We can't wait to welcome you back, those of you who are based in Australia, when it is safe to do so. Copies of Chris's book are available in the gift shop, but if you want to get one, given we're not quite sure when we're coming out of lockdown again, obviously it's available through all good bookstores and online resources. But if anyone's interested in joining us for future events, on Thursday, the 9th of September, the Chau Chak Wing Museum will present a talk on early volcanoes in the Pacific region by Professor Chris Ballard from the Australian National University as part of New South Wales History Week. And on the Thursday, the 30th of September, it's a great privilege for us to be able to join the partial historians who are going to be recording a podcast episode live as a Zoom event. I don't quite know what could possibly go wrong, but we're going to try it. And Fiona and Peter, who are the pastoral historians. For those of you who've never heard their podcast, it's an absolute treat, the way that they've been exploring Roman history from the Republic through to the Empire. So lots of things going on. We're also working on some events for October at the moment as well. So stay tuned with the Chau Chak Wing Museum's website or our social media pages. Chris, of course, is on Twitter and Facebook as well. And nothing left to do beyond saying thank you, Chris. If everyone could join us in thanking Chris digitally, as is the way nowadays. I hope you are able to get back to Egypt very soon, and we can't wait to get you to Australia at some point in the near future. And for those of you interstate or overseas, again, when it is safe to travel again, make sure the Chau Chak Wing Museum is one of your Australian destinations. We cannot wait to show you around. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, everyone who's joined us, and the very best from us in Sydney And on behalf of Candice and myself, have a lovely evening, have a lovely day, have a lovely wherever in the world you are from, whatever time it is. Thank you.